So we are back to talk about some more Bridgerton. This is season 4's part 2 of episodes, and if you would like to see my video on part 1, I will link it in the corner for you. But let's dive straight into this one. So we left off at the very end of the last episode in part 1 with Benedict unfortunately asking Sophie to be his mistress. Yeah. Now, he had asked this because he believes that he's now in love with her, but he doesn't want to be ostracized by his family and society. So he sees her being his mistress as kind of the only option in this day and age that they're in. However, the request is disrespectful as hell, considering that Sophie isn't that type of woman. So after avoiding him for a little while, she finally explains why that request was quite disrespectful, because he was still chasing her down at this point, and he was very much so still confused as to why she didn't want to give him an answer, which is crazy that his brain really couldn't compute that, but we're gonna move on. So regardless, she explains why the answer would be a hard no, and he eventually comes up with another plan to basically never marry, and he and Sophie can just live in his cottage on the countryside and live happily ever after. Now, Sophie ends up giving him some action that night because she's all excited, thinking this plan could really work, and they could be together. And that was definitely the most I've seen on screen since Daphne and Simon, if you know what I mean. But afterwards, Sophie really wholeheartedly believes that she might be pregnant. And this becomes a little bit of a running theme in this show. It's like, girl, you literally just had sex like 2 seconds ago. Like, let's just chill for right now, you know? But regardless, now she's counting down the days to the start of her period, and Benedict is over here planning this whole life with Sophie, completely ignoring the fact that they'll be shunned. And I honestly think that at first he would have been okay with it, but after a while, he would definitely start to resent Sophie for it. But we'll put a pin in that for now and hop on over to Violet and Lord Anderson. Now, Violet is definitely having some fun, talking about how she's the tea that Lord Anderson is going to be drinking. I was like, well, okay then. You go on ahead now, Miss Violet. For a little while after that, they definitely continue to enjoy each other, but trying to still be sneaky about it since Violet doesn't really want her kids to know just yet, which I kind of understand, but at the same time, I'm like, you're a grown woman and same goes for most of your kids. At this point, you know, who cares? But anywho. Now, Violet is also catching on that Sophie might not be telling them the whole truth about who she really is, especially after they have tea together and how Sophie conducts herself like she had been brought up to be a lady of a house and not a maid. Which, as we already know, is the case considering that she was the past Earl of Penwood's daughter and he still treated her as such until his passing, and Araminta just kind of wrecked everything. But Violet was trying to sniff all that out while Sophie is out here still flirting with the idea of getting a new job, but this was before she knew of Benedict's new plan, of course. Next, we got Francesca and Lord Sterling, or John. So after Michaela, John's cousin, comes to visit, she's taken up a lot of his free time outside of work and politics to chat and hang out, which is understandable considering they were pretty close. But Francesca is a bit annoyed by it, especially since she really wants to get pregnant, it seems. So against John's wishes, she tries to hook Michaela up with someone, and it doesn't go over so well with John or Michaela. But eventually Francesca is able to smooth things over with both of them, and just when they're all getting along, John unfortunately dies. And Francesca, at least at first, isn't really processing this news well. Michaela tries to present her idea of celebrating John's life with a party instead of mourning it, but Francesca isn't really hearing any of it. However, now she's deluded herself into thinking she's now pregnant with John's child, and she's also telling her family, and they're getting all excited, but I think we all knew that she wasn't pregnant. And after they did a quick check, because they had to see if there actually was an heir after John died, they figured out pretty quickly that she wasn't carrying a child, which made her feel even worse. And she finally vents all these feelings to her mom, Violet, who now had been proposed to by Lord Anderson, and she was now asking him to basically postpone telling anyone because of everything that was going on with Francesca. Eventually, though, she and Michaela are able to reconnect and throw this party in John's memory. But then Michaela just basically ditches her right after she asks if she can stay because she really needed someone to still help with the pain of losing John. So that definitely wasn't a good look for Michaela. In between time though, the younger Bridgertons, Hyacinth and Gregory, would have their presentation, and y'all, that dance dang near took me out how unserious that was. Now, Hyacinth and Eloise aren't really in the best of spots because Eloise made it pretty clear that she isn't really interested in the whole coming out to society and marriage thing when clearly Hyacinth was. But Gregory, on the other hand, dang near fell in love at first sight with Miss Rochelle after only dancing for a couple of minutes. And Eloise also has an admirer, it seems, and her confusion in this moment is so relatable. I literally saw myself in her for a second. Because I would be like, are you trying to get my attention, or did you just want me to get someone else's attention for you? Like, that would literally be me. I would genuinely be confused for a good couple of seconds. Now, the queen, while all this is going on, is just looking to keep herself entertained. She gave up the whole diamond of the season thing and just decided to set her sights on Benedict and his love life, because now she has a wager with Penelope if he'll be next for marriage. But she's also trying to simultaneously figure out who this mysterious woman is that he met at the ball at the beginning of the season. And this is how Lady Danbury ends up squeezing Alice in there. And Alice basically becomes the queen's eyes and ears around the Bridgertons, and she informs the queen that Benedict hasn't been able to find this mysterious woman yet. But now she also knows that he and Sophie are entangled, but she doesn't say anything just yet. But the queen does eventually allow Penelope to give up writing for Lady Whistledown, especially since people now knew who she was, and it definitely ruined the mystique and intrigue around that. So now she's free to write what she wants to write, which I felt made the most sense, because if she continued, it's like, okay, what's the point of this? Now, surprisingly, the queen also lets Lady Danbury leave to go and travel and relieve her of her lady-in-waiting duties, which I knew she would do eventually because she couldn't hold someone that she refers to as a friend as a hostage. But back to Sophie and Benedict real quick. So Violet eventually sees that there's something going on between them two, and she knows what might happen to their family's reputation if this gets out. So she tries to get Anthony to come back home to talk some sense into Benedict, and we also get to see a little bit of Kate and their baby, but only for a few minutes. But Anthony ends up threatening to cut Benedict off, but regardless, Benedict is still holding to his decision to be with Sophie and just deal with the alienation. However, Sophie comes to the realization that this just wasn't going to work out. It sounded nice in theory and in their heads, but logically, it just wasn't feasible, especially when or if they had kids. She feared that they'd be looked down upon and treated like how she was, being the outside child of the Earl and her mother, who was his maid. So she didn't want that life for herself or her children, and she communicates that to Benedict, who has a hard time with her decision, but he eventually accepts it because he knows that she was making some sense here. So at this point, Sophie has accepted a job that she would need to travel to the Americas for, but Araminta is still hunting her down, really because she just wants to ruin her life at this point, because Sophie wasn't even bothering her anymore. She didn't live with her or even work for her at this point. But since Rosmond was able to get engaged, for some reason, Araminta was even more determined to track Sophie down. Posey ends up spotting her at the Bridgerton house, but doesn't really say anything. She just warns Sophie that her mom, Araminta, was looking for her. To which Sophie tells her that she shouldn't worry about her because she was going to be leaving the country for a job pretty soon. Now, Posey, not really seeing the danger in sharing this information because she thought Sophie was going to be in the clear, she tells Araminta that Sophie was leaving for the Americas, and she wasted no time getting to the Bridgerton house. And Sophie, right as she's about to leave the house, gets arrested and thrown in jail without anyone knowing where she went, including Benedict, who rushes to her room after finding her necklace on the floor, and he has an epiphany that the mystery woman he met at the ball was wearing this necklace that night. So when he gets to Sophie's room, he pretty much figured out that it was indeed Sophie who was the mystery woman, and he finds out from one of the maids that Sophie was heading to the Americas because that's all they knew at the time. They didn't know that she was actually in jail awaiting trial. But they eventually get news that she was now in court, and he and Violet rush over there to vouch for Sophie against Araminta, and they eventually let her go but had her on house arrest. So Benedict puts the idea in Sophie's head that Araminta might be hiding something from her since she's trying so hard to put her in jail, or worse, have her put to death. So Sophie sneaks back into the Penwood house where the new Earl and his wife were now living, and y'all, I was too surprised to find out that Cressida was now the new Countess of Penwood. But Eloise uses her connection to Cressida to sneak Sophie into the house to find her father's will. Eventually, they find out that Araminta was hiding the fact that the Earl had left Sophie, Posey, and Rosmond an equal inheritance amount. But Araminta was using Sophie's share to add to Rosmond and Posey's dowry to get them good marriage prospects. And she also just kept Sophie in the house as their maid without paying her to take the annual stipend that was promised if she continued to live in the house with them. So they came up with a plan to approach Araminta at a ball with all this information, and she comes clean that it was really just because she was jealous that Sophie was there in the first place and that an illegitimate child could possibly have a good life and upbringing. Because God help us if you actually have people out here taking care of their children, whether they be born in a marriage or not. But anyway, Araminta was still trying to push this narrative that Sophie had impersonated nobility at the Bridgerton ball. But Violet was like, woman, if you keep these shenanigans up, we might have to talk about the fact that you embezzled Sophie's dowry and dishonored the Earl's will. So Araminta decided she didn't want those problems. Now, with the help of Alice, Lady Danbury was able to convince the Queen to go and meet Sophie, and Violet tells her that Sophie is the daughter of the late Earl's cousin and says that she came from the countryside. So the Queen ends up giving her blessing, and Araminta accepts defeat. Now, Rosamund's engagement is called off after he finds out about her dowry, and now Benedict and Sophie are free to do whatever they want, including get married, since he proposes soon after. But I am just a little worried that someone might look into that and find out that she was illegitimate, but I'm hoping that that doesn't happen. However, we pretty much wrap up the season with Violet telling Lord Anderson that she doesn't really want to get married right now because she wants to regain who she was before she was married all those years ago. And now she was just starting to get that back. So Lord Anderson was basically like, look, you can do you, but I'm not about to sit here and wait for you because there are things I want in this life, and marriage and settling down with one person is one of them. And no, they couldn't just do what people do these days and just continue to see each other without being married, because obviously back in those days, that was scandalous. But regardless, one of my favorite moments of this whole season was what happened after that, when we find out that there might be a new Lady Whistledown. And honestly, I am ecstatic because to me, she was definitely an important component of this show. But that's going to be it for this season. It was definitely a much needed improvement from season 3 for me. Don't know about y'all, but you can let me know your thoughts. I was pretty happy with how this season turned out. Now, my last question would be, who do you think is going to be the next Bridgerton up for the next season? Let me know who you think it's going to be down in the comments, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.